Today we are looking at a case from the first part of the 19th century, so sit back as we go to England. By the late 1820s, Britain was a nation in the midst of profound change. The Industrial Revolution had transformed towns and cities across the country, creating new industries and new opportunities for trade. Yet for thousands of poor families, and especially for orphaned and abandoned children, life remained harsh. There was no national welfare system, no compulsory education, and very few legal protections. Instead, responsibility for the poorest members of society rested largely with the local parish under the poor laws. One common solution was the apprenticeship system. Children who became a burden on the parish, often because they had lost one or both parents, or because their families could no longer support them, were sent to work as apprentices for local employers. The children would have to work for a set number of years, where they would learn a trade and be given food, clothing, shelter and instruction. In theory, this was intended to give them skills needed to earn an honest living as adults, but in practice, much depended upon the character of the employer. While some apprentices were treated fairly, others found themselves trapped in extremely poor conditions. Among the trades that relied heavily on child labour was tambour embroidery, a delicate form of decorative needlework in which patterns were created by using a small hooked needle to pull thread through fabric, stretched tightly over a round wooden frame. The technique allowed workers to produce detailed designs, which often featured flowers, borders, and intricate patterns, and was used on items of clothing, shawls, and household decorations. Although it was a skilled craft that required patience and precision, the work was repetitive and time-consuming, making children attractive to employers because they could be paid less while spending long hours completing the fine stitching. One of those engaged in the trade was Mrs. Esther Hibner, who lived at Platt Terrace on the Pancras Road in London. She opened a tambour workshop from her home and employed several parish apprentices, which was applied to her by different London parishes. To those responsible for placing children into apprenticeships, her business appeared respectable enough. There was little reason to suspect that behind the doors of her house, the children entrusted to her care would endure any form of cruelty. Working alongside her were her adult daughter, also named Esther Hibner, and Anne Robinson, who assisted with the embroidery. The household was not only a workplace for the children, it was also their home, and the girls relied entirely upon the three women responsible for their training, supervision and care. One of the children who worked there was Frances Colpitt, a 9-year-old girl who, like many parish apprentices of the period, had come from the workhouse. She had been under the care of St Martin's in the Fields, one of London's largest and busiest parishes. On the 7th of April 1828, the parish officers sent her to the home of Mrs. Esther Hibner, where she was told she would learn the trade of tambour work. For Frances, the apprenticeship was meant to offer a future. She would learn a skill, receive food and shelter, and eventually be able to support herself. However, shortly after she arrived, the atmosphere within the household changed dramatically, and all of the apprentices began to be subjected to a regime of relentless labour and severe punishment. Their day often began long before sunrise. The girls were forced out of bed at 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning and immediately set to work at the embroidery frames. They remained there throughout the day and late into the evening, and sometimes did not finish until 11 o'clock at night. The work itself required complete concentration. Hour after hour, the children sat bent over frames, stitching delicate patterns, while their bodies became increasingly exhausted. Even when they were allowed to work normal hours, they had little opportunity to rest and were rarely permitted to leave the house. Food was something else that was scarce. Breakfast, when it was provided, consisted of little more than a slice of bread and a cup of milk, but sometimes even this was withheld, which meant that the children had to work for hours on empty stomachs. Later in the day they might receive a few potatoes before doing more work, and they would not then have anything more to eat until the following morning. Mrs. Hibner started rationing their food so severely that only 9 pounds of potatoes were divided at a mealtime to feed the entire household of 12 people. Meat was served only once a fortnight, and due to this, hunger became a constant companion, and the girls were driven to desperate measures. Some would eat scraps of fish and meat intended for the household cat and dog, and pick up pieces of food that had been collected for the pig. The living conditions were also very bad. Mrs. Hibner and her daughter enjoyed proper beds, warm bedding and comfortable clothing, while the apprentices frequently slept on the floor, and during the coldest months of the year, they had little more than a single rug or blanket to cover themselves. Their work left them physically exhausted, yet they were given almost no opportunity to recover before another punishing day began. Even on Sundays, when many working people found relief from their labours, the girls remained confined indoors. If Mrs. Hibner went out, she was known to lock the girls inside the kitchen, with the windows closed. As the weeks passed, the effects of this treatment became increasingly visible. The children grew weak from hunger and overwork, and their health deteriorated. Yet Mrs. Hibner made no effort to reduce their workload or to improve their diets. Instead, her punishments became harsher. By the beginning of 1829, one of the youngest girl's condition had become a matter of serious concern to those who saw her. Her name was Frances Colpitt, and she had entered Mrs. Hibner's household as a parish apprentice in 1828, but was by now weak, malnourished, and suffering from injuries that revealed the extent of the treatment she had endured. The young girl found it increasingly difficult to keep up with the demands placed upon her, but despite this, Mrs. Hibner and her daughter made her continue working, although she was now physically unable to perform her duties. As she did not do the work as instructed, she was given even more punishment. On one occasion, the younger Hibner removed Frances from the work frame and knocked her to the floor. She then lifted her up and struck her down again. On another occasion, when Frances was lying on the floor in the room in a very bad way, the elder Mrs. Hibner simply said, "Let her lie there," and refused to arrange for the child to see a doctor. By this stage, the young girl was so weak that even ordinary household tasks had become almost impossible. Yet she was still expected to work and given more menial tasks to do, such as cleaning the stairs. She did her best to work, but eventually she collapsed from exhaustion. The young girl's grandmother, Mrs. Frances Gibbery, had tried to visit her granddaughter on many occasions, but each time had been turned away by Mrs. Hibner, who made various excuses as to why the girl could not be seen. Eventually, Mrs. Gibbery informed the parish overseer, a man named Mr. Blackman, who decided to visit Mrs. Hibner's residence along with the surgeon, Mr. Charles James Wright. When they arrived, Mrs. Hibner tried to deny them entry, but Mr. Blackman reminded her that she had no authority to stop him seeing the children. When the two men got inside, they discovered a scene of horror and absolute neglect. They found all the apprentices in a terrible state. Recognizing the seriousness of Frances Colpitt's condition, the doctor ordered the young girl to be immediately removed from the Hibner home and transferred to the St. Pancras Workhouse Infirmary for urgent care. The doctor and nurses there tried to look after her, but her injuries were too severe, and on the 15th of March, she died. The authorities launched a formal investigation into the home. A parish officer named Mr. Dewan visited the residence to secure the location and protect the remaining children. He soon realized, however, that the girls were terrified and deeply traumatized. So frightened were they of being flogged or punished for speaking out that they initially tried to hide from him. Other parish officers were called to assist, along with the parish medical officer, whose initial examination revealed the full extent of the abuse. One girl was so weak that she could scarcely be lifted from her bed, and the doctor concluded that the children's critical condition was entirely the result of prolonged starvation and severe physical abuse. All the children were removed from the house, and the parish officers brought Mrs. Hibner, her daughter, and Anne Robinson before the magistrates. By now, rumours had spread regarding the terrible conditions to which Mrs. Hibner had subjected the girls, and the magistrates' court was filled with an outraged public. The anger grew worse as the surviving girls described being forced to sleep on the floor, receiving only one meagre meal a day, and having to resort to stealing food meant for the house dog and cat, simply to stay alive. The hearing, however, took a darker turn when the court questioned the girls about the abuse suffered by the child who had just died. They said that Frances had been singled out for even harsher treatment and had to endure more beatings and was given less food. When the defendants attempted to explain or excuse the child's treatment, the magistrate refused to hear them. He said that it was better that they remain silent than try and justify such appalling cruelty. He ended by saying that the circumstances surrounding Frances's death demanded a full investigation, and as there were other rumours about private burials within the house, the magistrate said that all three women would be remanded in custody. The trial commenced on the 10th of April 1829 at the Old Bailey in London. Esther Hibner, her daughter, and Anne Robinson all stood accused of the willful murder of Francis Colpitt, a 9-year-old parish apprentice. The case was opened by Mr. Bolland, who appeared for the prosecution. He told the jury that the evidence they were about to hear would naturally fill them with horror, but added that he was thankful that such a case was rare in Britain. At the centre of the trial was a question of responsibility. Francis Colpitt had not died from a single act of violence. Instead, the prosecution claimed that her death had been caused by a prolonged course of neglect, starvation, and physical abuse, while she was under the care of Mrs. Esther Hibner. The evidence presented revealed that Francis was not the only child suffering inside the house. When giving their testimony, the other girls described a pattern of harsh treatment affecting all of them. They spoke of hunger, exhaustion, and repeated physical punishments. The jury heard how it came to be that Francis had been placed with Mrs. Hibner by the parish of St. Martin's in the Fields, and how when she entered the household, she was a healthy young girl, but had gradually been reduced to a terrible physical condition. The court also heard evidence about Francis's final days. Witnesses described how she had become so weak that she could barely move around the house, and despite this was expected to carry out her work. Frances Gibbery, the child's grandmother, testified that she had attempted to visit her granddaughter on numerous occasions, but she was repeatedly turned away by Mrs. Hibner, who fabricated various excuses to keep the girl from being seen. John Blackman, the overseer, also testified and described finding the children and realising that they were being starved. Susan Whitney and Mary Herford, who were both apprentices for Mrs. Hibner, told how they worked long hours and were given little food, and said that if their work was not up to the required standard, they were beaten, and food was then withheld. Medical witnesses gave evidence about the condition of Francis's body after her death. The doctors who examined the deceased child said that her condition was horrifying. They said that they found extensive injuries and signs of severe neglect. Looking at the judge, one doctor said that the child's death was not the result of natural causes, but was directly connected to the treatment she had received while under the care of Mrs. Hibner. The medical practitioners also said that the girl had severe injuries on her feet, with sores that had become so serious that parts of her toes were affected by mortification. The case attracted considerable attention, not only because it involved the death of a young child, but also the failure of a system that had been designed to protect poor children. In early 19th century London, stories of abused parish apprentices were not uncommon, but cases resulting in death caused particular outrage. These children had not been placed with strangers. They had been formally entrusted to employers by parish authorities. The question was therefore not only what had happened to Francis Colpitt, but how such treatment had been allowed to continue. Mrs. Hibner offered no defence, while her daughter claimed that the apprentices had given false testimony and insisted that the children had been treated kindly. She argued that there was no foundation for the accusations made against her and her mother. Anne Robinson, the other woman charged in connection with the case, also denied the allegations, stating that she had only assisted Mrs. Hibner with her business, and she never slept at the house. Instead, she left each evening. After hearing the evidence, the jury considered the case carefully, but eventually concluded that Mrs. Esther Hibner was guilty of murder. However, when the judge asked them how they found the younger Esther Hibner and Anne Robinson, the foreman replied that they found them both not guilty. The judge ordered that Mrs. Esther Hibner would be executed the following Monday and that her body would be given up for dissection. A second indictment was also brought against her concerning the death of another apprentice, but because a capital conviction had already been secured, it was considered unnecessary to proceed further with that charge. During the trial, observers had noted that Mrs. Hibner had shown little outward emotion and displayed no apparent remorse for the suffering of the children or fear for the punishment that awaited her. After being removed from the courtroom, she was taken to Newgate Prison, where her behaviour continued to attract attention. She became increasingly agitated and insisted that she would not be hanged. She also became angry when her requests were refused, including her demand for better food. She was visited by her daughter, but the meeting appeared to have little effect upon her hardened mind, and she showed no visible emotion as they parted. As the execution approached, the prison chaplain, Mr. Cotton, attempted to offer her religious guidance and support. However, Mrs. Hibner refused his assistance, stating that she understood the Bible herself and required no interpreter. Although he continued speaking with her until a late hour, she remained unmoved and did not seem to be paying him much attention. On the morning of the 13th of April 1829, Mrs. Esther Hibner was taken from the condemned cell. However, because she refused to walk, she had to be supported and carried by two men as she was taken to the place of execution. Outside, a large crowd had gathered. Public executions in this period attracted thousands of spectators, and in this case, many people had come because of the widespread anger that had surrounded Francis Colpitt's death. Reports stated that loud cries, yells, and expressions of hostility came from the crowd, particularly from the women who had gathered to witness the punishment. At the scaffold, Mrs. Hibner said nothing. She looked straight ahead in silence and made no final statement before the sentence was carried out. The same day that Mrs. Hibner was executed, her daughter and Anne Robinson faced a separate trial for the lesser offence of assaulting the apprentices placed in their care. This time both women were found guilty. Miss Esther Hibner the younger received a year in prison, while Anne Robinson was sentenced to 4 months in a house of correction. Hello everyone, and thank you so much for listening. As usual, please leave any comments or feedback you may have, and I hope to see you all again in the next Brief Case.